sounds better now. And we are at 7:05. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Rob Kwan, and on the agenda for you, we have a quick recap of the primary results and preview of the November council runoffs. And then I'll hand it over to Jamie, who's going to give you a run through on how to file an ethics complaint and everything you might need to know about that enforcement process. And I'll be jumping back in to give you a look at why the city of Los Angeles needs an Office of the Public Advocate, which you might be wondering, what the hell is that? The city of New York has one, and it would be great for us here in Los Angeles. And I hope when we get into that, you will find it just as interesting as I am, interesting as I do. I often get a lot of shit because this is my pet project, but we'll turn to that in a bit, and then we'll just run through some really brief updates on some recent news in City Hall, and then we'll talk a little bit, just briefly, on the letter that the Fair Rep LA Coalition has put together on Charter Commission recommendations. So with that, let's jump into the next slide. And just to give you a heads up, this is being recorded, and the slideshow recording and links that are included in here or referenced in here will all be posted on the website. You can go check out the blog tab, and you can also, when you jump in there, find the March open meeting and recording, everything you need there, etc. And as we go through, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And we will have time at the kind of the end of each section for kind of any open questions if there's anything big, but drop them in the chat, and Ross or Jamie will flag that for me, and vice versa as we go through speaking on these different things. So first things first, we just got through our March primary here in the city of Los Angeles. That had a relatively low turnout. It might sound bad, a little under 29%, but remember, before we aligned our elections with state and federal elections, we had elections that were getting decided by 15, 20, 25% of voters. So this is definitely a much bigger improvement over what we were working with, but very disappointing to see. We were about nearly 10% below the turnout we had 4 years ago in the March 2020 primary. One interesting dynamic here is, the Democratic primary was not energizing like we had in 2020, where there were, Michael Bloomberg dropping billions of dollars. We had a number of candidates driving out Democrats from all different kind of political persuasions. Whereas now there are a lot of people who, Joe Biden was not driving them to the polls. And even if they made it to the polls, they might have left that blank or thrown their vote somewhere else. We on the other hand, saw on the Republican end of things a drive from some rightward candidates, whether you're looking at the local level with the district attorney's race, where we had a former Republican make the runoff against George Gascon. We saw Adam Schiff boosting up Steve Garvey, the Republican he was running against for Senate. And the net result of that is we had a slightly higher turnout among Republicans than we did amongst Democrats. This was also an older, wider electorate. You can look at these stats on the right side of the screen. And over there, you can see this is all from PDI's ballot tracker, and this is via the city of Los Angeles. And just to be clear, these are all of the votes cast in the city of LA, not necessarily people that voted in one of the local council races, etc. If you look at that, it's just really remarkable to see that, we had amongst the youth, 18 to 34, just 16% turnout. Whereas, those over 65 were getting close to 50%. White voters turning out at a significantly higher rate than, African Americans, Asians, and Latinos just below them as well. So we are looking at a much, 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 much different electorate in November. Who knows if we will hit the absurdly high turnout we did in November of 2020. But, even if we just get up to 70%, that's going to be almost 3 times the turnout we had in some of these races just this month in March. So that's just something that can't be emphasized enough. We are looking at an electorate that is going to be 2 to 3 times the size of that we had in March. On the council district side of things, we had a number of candidates win outright by securing over 50% of the vote. Councilmember Rahman squeaked in with just over 50%. Councilmember Padilla with a big win, just like Councilmember Harris Dawson. And then, unfortunately, a lot of us were really hoping to see Serena Oberstein come through in District 12, and Councilmember Lee really demolished there. It really just goes to show, the power of incumbency, as well as, the absurd leg up that you can get when a candidate is benefiting from outside spending on their behalf on the scale that he was receiving. There was close to over $600,000 just put in an independent field campaign for him. When you look at Serena Oberstein, there are much fewer people knocking on the doors on her behalf, and that's something that definitely paid off for him. If we can go to the next slide. Before I turn to the next races, I just want to point one thing out. And that's just kind of, there's some people that like to say Councilmember Rahman, is that really a win? She barely got over 50%. Well, if this thing were being decided in November, you can bet she would have been winning by much, much more than she did. And I think there's just something remarkable in that race, given the way she ran. She could have run that campaign in a different way, where after she was redistricted a few years ago, changed the way she voted on things and taken a much more conservative track. But she didn't. There's a lot of people that might gripe that, they wish she were more progressive, but it's important to just appreciate the district that she is in. She ran a clean money campaign like she did the first time. And unlike some of her, predecessors that faced competitive elections like Councilmember Rue, Cedillo, and O'Farrell, she did not jump out the gate and try to build a $1 million war chest to just, take on the world. She raised a relatively moderate amount of money when it comes to an incumbent, did not benefit from an overwhelming amount of IEs, independent spending on the outside. Her opponent got the majority of that by far. Actually ran a grassroots campaign where you're getting small dollar donors and running a field campaign. That's something that David Rue did really, really well in 2015, raising small dollar money and knocking on doors. That's not something he did in 2020. And he really got caught flat-footed there. And another notable thing, we've seen so many of our incumbents and the IEs just doling out absurd attack ads. And she received a lot of that and did not, choose to go that route herself. So, most of our council members, we could never really expect them to do anything like this, but it is just good to see like a proof of concept that you don't need to sell your soul to get reelected to LA City Council. If we can go to the next slide. First up, we have District 14 with Isabel Jurado in the runoff versus Kevin De Leon. And I chose to use these graphics from Observable HQ, which I think give a good idea of how turnout with early versus later voters shifts. And I think when you look at that second half, as far as, the vote share when it's coming in, you can start to appreciate who is turning out in that later phase as we get a whole lot more Democrats, as we get a whole lot more young people, a whole lot more diverse non-white voters coming in. What is the net result? And it varies from district to district and it, matchup to matchup. But you can see that, very clearly Isabel did much better amongst the later voters that were coming in. Um, Kevin De Leon did much, much, much worse with those voters. You also see that Miguel Santiago did not really get any kind of uptick, and neither did Wendy Carrillo as things went in, more votes were being counted. So just gives you a good preview for what we're kind of looking at. This is literally one of the most progressive districts in the city, right up there with District 1 and 13. So this is a favorable environment for Isabel Jurado as far as going to a higher turnout runoff. Um, the biggest thing with this race is just the overwhelmingly high negatives that Kevin De Leon has. That is going to be extremely difficult for him to overcome. And just kind of seeing the way he has stubbornly held on to things, I think we are in store for all kinds of shenanigans from Kevin De Leon, and attempts to muck up this thing and try to dirty his opponent. The really big thing here is kind of what's going to happen with outside spending in this race. If we were looking at a Jurado versus Santiago runoff, that would be a very, very brutal fight, and there would be millions of dollars coming in outside spending to boost up Santiago and tear down Isabel Jurado. We're not going to see that here. There might be some folks that decide to get in, and take some shots, if anything, just to weaken Isabel Jurado. But I think the big question is the LA Police Protective League gonna throw down in this race? Um, it's just not necessarily a great use of your money, when it comes to throwing down for a lost cause. So he definitely turned some heads with the way he was able to raise money the first time around. One thing to note is for these LA City Council runoffs, candidates have more money in public matching funds at their disposal, and right out the gate, they get a decent sized check from the Ethics Commission. So both of them used the system pretty well last time around. And I think for Isabel Jurado, it's just going to be about building on what she did the first time around and knocking on a lot of doors, talking to voters, and building as strong of a grassroots campaign as they can. District 14 is a little tough because when you get down south in downtown LA, that's not necessarily the best place to be knocking on doors. But all in all, this is one where it's hard to see. They're not giving any predictions here today. This is way, 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 way too early to be giving any sort of predictions. But I think it is fair to say that Isabel Jurado has a very solid leg up in this race, given the extremely high negatives that Kevin De Leon is dealing with, and just kind of sizing up what the other vote is that's out there. And I just don't see a ton of Wendy Carrillo voters jumping to Kevin De Leon. Um, there's a lot of overlapping base between Kevin De Leon and Miguel Santiago, especially when you get south towards the downtown LA, Boyle Heights, El Sereno, Lincoln Heights area. But even then, this is not good territory for an incumbent to be in. This is a record low performance for an incumbent. We have literally never seen anything like this in over 20 years. One fun little project will be to go back through the archives and try to find out the last time we had an incumbent perform this poorly. With that, I just want to pause and see if there's anything Jamie or Ross want to add in. Otherwise, we can hop on to the next slide.
Nothing for me. It's going to be an interesting race.
I'm good.
let's go to the next one. And for this one, we have Councilmember Hutt, who was appointed to this office, versus Grace Yu. A very fascinating race to see, the trend lines for Grace Yu versus Eddie Anderson. Gives you a good insight into how Grace Yu was right up there with Heather Hutt in those early results, heavily bolstered, by Asian Americans in the Koreatown area. And as the electorate had fewer and fewer of those voters coming in, we had Eddie Anderson doing much, much better. And Heather Hutt still holding very strong consistently. Not a lot of uptick for Aura Vasquez. Um, Generally speaking, Heather Hutt would have probably been, a whole lot more worried about facing Eddie Anderson or Aura Vasquez, just because, um, politically speaking, that's going to be putting her in a tough space with somebody to her left. Whereas now she's running against Grace Yu, who is a bit to her right, a bit more so on some issues. I think now that we're entering an electorate where Heather Hutt has some big advantages. And that being said, she is not necessarily a known commodity in the way some of the other candidates or incumbents at least are. Has a whole lot of work to do as far as really getting out there. Towards the end of the primary, she wasn't necessarily participating in forums and debates in the way some of the other candidates were. I think that's in part because she knew she was sitting in a strong place. Now that she is in a one-on-one race versus an opponent to her right, I think she'll be a whole lot more out there. Um, with this race, I think on the ethics issues, that's going to be an interesting area to see how Councilmember Hutt continues to perform. She's been pretty good on those issues, but Grace Yu has some real strengths there. With this race, we'll definitely see some IE spending for both of the candidates. If the past cycle for Yu versus MRT is any kind of precedent, but I think the big question is the LAPPL gonna really pick a dog in this race and do anything? And I Heather Hutt has been in the middle-ish left of the council. There have been some times where she's been willing to speak on some things that I'm sure make the LAPPL come uncomfortable, but she's also voted their way. So this is one where just pivoting to the next race, I think that kind of sets things up. And in the chat, I'm seeing some commentary on 4118. Both of the candidates are pretty bad on 4118. And I think for Heather Hutt, when it comes to her ability to um, work with the left or more progressive voters and endear herself to them, she has the most work to do on those issues. There's definitely been a noticeable change in the kind of cooperation with housing rights activists, people who work with the unhoused, a huge drop off from Councilmember Ridley Thomas to Councilmember Hutt. And that's definitely an area that I think it'll be interesting to see if there's any daylight between them. With that, we can go to the next race. And I'm going to be a little brief just because I am running over time right now. But this is a very, very fascinating race. I would not have been willing to put money on Jillian Burgos winning. I was rooting for her. I knew she had a viable path. But just really can't say enough how impressive of a performance as a campaign that was. Just like the last race, and even a bit more exaggerated, is the kind of shift in the electorate and its composition. As we get younger, as we get a higher Latino turnout, we see Jillian Burgos overtaking Sam Kabushian, whereas he really does drop off the map and even almost falls down to Manny Gonez, who makes some steady progress through and through, but still hanging low. This is a much better electorate for Jillian Burgos in November. I think the big question there is like, how well are they going to be able to use these next months to build a strong enough campaign to get up to 50% while also weathering the attacks? And you can look at District 12. I would have been curious to see where a flash poll would have got you on those results 3 weeks before Election Day, before Serena was being pummeled left and right in the mail. So this is one where I think that the biggest variable is, if the LAPPL is not going to be spending money in District 14 and they're not spending it in District 10, are they going to just unleash holy hell on District 2? So this is the biggest toss up out of all three. I think you can look at the first two and say Isabel has a leg up and Heather Hutt has a leg up. But this is a genuine kind of toss up, and I'm sure it is driving Mr. Nazarian and Mr. Krikorian a bit crazy at the moment. And with that, unless there's anything from Jamie or Ross to add before we close out the election stuff, we can turn to the next slide.
Let's turn on over to Jamie for filing an ethics complaint.
Hi. Um, so a lot of people have reached out to me as part of my work on neighborhood councils or just as part of election campaigns. And they want to know how to file an ethics complaint. And LA City Ethics is very targeted in the things that it's in terms of its purview. So it includes things like campaign finance, um, some work with developers, contracts, governmental ethics, and lobbying. And obviously, some of the campaign finance disclosures, things like that, are a really popular one in the context of campaigns. But if we go to the next slide, I do want to start by just giving the disclaimer. This is not legal advice. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not your lawyer. However, if you do need advice, ethics offers free informal guidance. So that if there's something that you're not sure of, if there's something as a campaign that you want to make sure that you get right, reaching out to them before you take that action is actually a really great and easy way to make sure that you're coloring within the lines. Alternatively, you can obtain your own legal counsel, but I really did want to just highlight that there is an available route for someone working on a campaign or someone having a question about ethics to take that route. So go to the next one. So 4 ways to file. You can email it to ethics.enforcement@lacity.org. You can call them. You can submit it online. There's a form that they have, or they even take walk-ins. One thing that's really important to highlight, you can make your complaint anonymously, perfectly fine. But if you do give your name, it is kept confidential within the parameters of that, unless they receive your permission, or if they're referring to the complaint to another agency, perhaps the FPPC would be a good example, or they're ordered by a court to release it. You're also protected against retaliation for blowing the whistle on coworkers and superiors. And another thing that I want to just highlight is that if you work for the city, someone in the city telling you not to file an ethics complaint is actually in of itself an ethics violation. So you're always encouraged to be able to file these complaints. So I wanted to talk about a little bit about what to expect when you file. So when you file the complaint, I think that it's important for people to understand that you're not going to be regularly updated. In fact, you might have sort of nothing at all that occurs. When you send an email, there generally will not be a confirmation that they've received the complaint, but they will reach out to you if there's additional questions that they have regarding your complaint, if there's follow-up to it. And so that's a really important thing to know in this process, is that because of the confidential nature of the work, this is not something that you're going to be involved in. And I think that some people, when they file these, they sort of expect that it's going to be something that they get an update, something that they get an immediate response to, but that's simply not how it works. So when you've made the complaint, the first thing that's going to happen is the director and deputy director of enforcement are going to review the complaint. And there's three things that could happen. Either it's going to be that no violation is identified and the complaint is closed. That happens frequently because sometimes people report things that aren't actually ethics violations. This happens a lot. Or they might say that this isn't their jurisdiction and they might refer it over to an outside agency such as the FPPC. Or lastly, they might say that a violation may exist and the complaint is assigned to an investigator. And then the investigator is going to conduct an initial review. And if they do find evidence that there is something that's been violated, that's when it's going to move forward. The investigator will then interview respondents and witnesses, issue subpoenas, and review evidence. And then lastly, if a violation is identified, the matter will move to either the settlement process or the administrative hearing process. So it just wanted to, with campaign work, I think we all spot a lot of small things frequently, and sometimes some very big things. But it's important to know and to not have the expectation that you're going to see sort of an immediate result from filing these. But it's still really important to file these complaints, because the Ethics Commission typically does not have the capacity to be sort of looking proactively. They are often depending on the public, on news media, for some of these cases. So I'd like to just highlight a few recent notable ethics violation cases to give a sense of some of the things that they've recently adjudicated. So the first one that I wanted to highlight was former council member Paul Koretz. He had a prohibited fundraiser with a sitting commissioner. So our governmental ethics ordinance, it doesn't allow commissioners to fundraise for candidates. So you can't appear on an invitation, you can't have it at the fundraiser at your house, and all of that occurred. So this was an instance where the Ethics Commission did a violation on Paul Koretz. And this was Jill Banks-Barad, who used to be an LADWP commissioner. And they actually separately found violations for her as well that actually went beyond just the Koretz fundraiser. I believe it was with David Rue. Another one that happened fairly recently that I think a lot of people had eyes on, just because Sean Bayless was Paul Koretz's former planning and land use deputy. This was a revolving door violation. So when you work in the city, you're prohibited for a period of 1 year from doing lobbying work on the city. And then there's also sort of a lifetime ban on stuff that you've previously worked on. And this applies to certain categories within the city in terms of employment for the revolving door. Some of you might remember the Hadid Mansion. This was a structure that was built by Mohammed Hadid, who's the dad of Gigi and Bella Hadid. It got quite a lot of press due to the size of the structure, the protests of folks in that neighborhood. Essentially, Mr. Bayless went from working for the council district to working for something called the Bel Air Association. And it was basically, he left and joined within a week. And a few months into that employment, he sent a letter on behalf of the Bel Air Association asking Mr. Koretz to essentially call the property a nuisance. And a really similar letter was submitted by Mr. Koretz regarding that property. Because this was done within 1 year, that's a revolving door violation. Then Another one that I want to highlight, and this is actually still an ongoing case because the Ethics Commission chose not to accept the stipulation agreement, which is something really unusual and we haven't seen in some time. This was the case of Les Moonves and Ian Metrose. Mr. Moonves had been accused of sexual assault, and an LAPD cop had been accused of essentially giving Mr. Moonves the unredacted copy of the sexual assault report, which is not legal because it's confidential information. And so, because of the egregiousness of this violation, the Ethics Commission is actually seeking to make them pay the full fine, which is still far, far, far too low. But it's the most that they can do within the laws that we currently have now, which have not been updated since the 90s when it comes to the fine amounts. But so this was essentially for the aiding and abetting of disclosure of confidential information and attempting to induce the misuse of city position. And this one got a lot of attention and press just because Mr. Moonves is the former CEO of CBS. And then the last one that I wanted to highlight was Michael Logrande. This has it's the largest fine ever issued by the Ethics Commission at $281,000 and 250, and that's with the discount that they typically give for cooperating. This is another example of a revolving door violation. He was the former director of city planning, but within that 1 year, he was taking clients and directly seeking to influence and lobby the planning department. And so that 281,000 is reflective of essentially 3 times the payments he received from these companies. And I think the fine could have been as high as 350,000, but he got a little bit of a reduction for cooperating. So I don't know if Ross or Rob have any comments on these parts, but just wanted to give a couple examples of the kinds of things our Ethics Commission is currently working on, and also how you can be a part of that process.
The only thing I would add is, and Jamie kind of touched on this, like there are sometimes where like we have a really complicated set of laws here in LA. High like a lot of transparency comes with like an administrative cost for campaigns. And even if you do your best, there might be times where you lapse or you upload the wrong thing. We've seen that before. So if there's something small and there's something just missing, like you can always just ask the Ethics Commission to flag it. It might not be something that you know is worth going after for filing an ethics violation. But the Ethics Commission does try to go out of its way to help candidates get it right and make sure they upload the right things. So if you think it's just something more incidental or you know something small, you don't necessarily need to go the ethics violation route. If that seems really formal, you can always just email the Ethics Commission and be like, hey, somebody filed an IE and there's no thing that's been filed for the communication for 2 weeks. What's going on? So that's all. All right, Ross,
Yeah.
I think it is public advocate time.
My favorite time.
Yes. So gonna go over a few things. And first and foremost, what are we trying to fix? What is the New York City Office of Public Advocate, and what could that do for the city of LA? And if we can go to the next slide, what are we trying to fix? Everybody has complaints about local city government, and that's in part because we have a dysfunctional government where each council member is supposed to represent 260,000 people, and they are underfunded because we give all of our money to the cops. But one really big consistent problem that has been highlighted, especially through these government reform committee meetings where we talk about council size and governance reform, is the really big complaint about delivery of services and how do we handle citizen complaints. And a lot of that is kind of, you know, departments have their role, but there are situations where there is a issue that requires multiple departments coordinating something. Or there are issues that happen across the city or in different unique parts of the city. So there's not necessarily a big citywide perspective other than the mayor or the CAO that's looking at things from a comprehensive perspective. And that's something where there's also nobody really holding the mayor and CAO accountable with these things, other than the council at times, delicately as they do through the budget process, maybe. We also don't really have anybody to independently enforce the charter. Our city attorney is the city's lawyer, which gives them a conflict of interest when it comes to actually enforcing the charter or the law. We also don't have a clear line of succession. And thankfully, Eric Garcetti did not get confirmed to his ambassadorship until long after he left the city of LA. But if he got approved beforehand, we would have been in a very significant charter situation, because there were news reports at the time that it wasn't really clear what was going to happen. And there were some under the belief that the council president, Nuri Martinez, could just stay on the council and also as mayor at the same time for however long she wanted. And there were some others who felt like we should be able to and have to appoint somebody. We didn't actually get to that point, but the lack of clarity in the charter is an issue, and one that is kind of an outstanding problem. We also don't really have a counterweight to the mayor and the council president. So a lot of times they just huddle up and hash things out behind closed doors. When you watch a council meeting, both what you see there in front of you and what you don't see and what happens behind the scenes is dominated by the council president. Everything from what makes it onto the agenda, what comes up first, whether they leave general public comment at the end of the meeting, or whether they bring it up, whether they have a closed session before they get to general public comment, how long public comment's going to be. Yes, the city council can, enforce rules and make a motion to do a thing or call something into question, but they really don't do that because they're all scared of the council president retaliating against them. We don't really have a citywide voice for the public at these council meetings. And there's a lot of deference where they just turn to the local person and say, you decide what you want to do, or that's your committee. I'm going to respect you. We have a lot of unanimous votes with very little discussion. And that's just something, the latter, that really I find mind numbing, because there are really important issues that come through sometimes where they choose not to discuss it, or they're shy about discussing it. And one good example would be the failure to provide remote public comment at committee meetings. That's something that I'm sure some council members would wish we do, but feel a little timid about speaking up. And we saw with Councilmember Bonin and Nuri Martinez right after COVID hit, she canceled all of the Friday meetings. And at a public meeting, he said, I think if anything, we should be meeting more often. And if you listen to the little podcast that Nuri put out last year, she identified that as the really big breaking point between them. So even though that's a really small thing, saying a few words, a dissenting vote or a dissenting voice does not come without a cost. So if we can go to the next slide. The New York City Public Advocate is elected at the same time as the mayor and comptroller. It's the same as the controller, just spelled differently. I don't know why. They serve a 4-year term. They are first in line to succeed the mayor. So if the mayor went out of the state, like we have sometimes, instead of the council president stepping in, the public advocate would. If the mayor vacated the office, they would be next in line to come in there. Because they are elected citywide and they have that number 2 kind of status, they have a unique ability to get media attention in a way that your average council member, even the council president, can't garner. So it is a position that, even though it doesn't necessarily have a lot of formal power, is able to draw that public attention. They are a watchdog, an ombudsman. They have some specific roles like a charter cop, beyond some ability to bring limited litigation, or make budget recommendations. They have a role as a charter cop. And right now we have a council president who is failed to appoint an ethics commissioner within the window that he's required by 250 days. Or even the example I gave with Nuri Martinez, disregarding the charter, which says you have to meet 3 times a week, and saying we're only going to meet 2 times a week for 2 years. That's something where there's nobody to really hold them accountable unless somebody in the public is maybe willing to sue over that. With the public advocate, they can actually bring an accusation that somebody is not failing or is failing to comply with the charter, and that public official is required to respond and explain what's going on. So it might not be the biggest, most powerful thing, but it does put people on the spot, and that has the ability to really change things. And before I go on, I know Jamie had a quick comment.
I also just wanted to say, with the questions about the charter, that's something that would be very significant for neighborhood councils. There's no real mechanism for us to challenge some of the edicts given by the city, but in particular, that's relevant for us right now because some neighborhood councils have been given advice by the city attorney's office based on the charter section regarding the city attorney, telling us that we're not allowed to comment on the activities of the city attorney, even though that goes against charter section 910 for us in particular, saying that we can't comment on active lawsuits. So it would be really great and I think very functional to have that sort of third party that could step in situations like this.
And this also brings up a very good point. This may be a bit in the weeds, but New York City does not have an elected city attorney. So they don't necessarily have the same kind of conflict of interest problems. For here in the city of Los Angeles, it would be very important for the public advocate to have independent outside counsel, because otherwise the city attorney would probably say, you don't have the power to weigh in on what the charter is or isn't. So a random tangent. The last thing I would just note, this office was previously there was an elected office voted on all people in New York for the council president. And they had a role in just presiding over the council meetings and really little else. And when they were coming up with charter reforms in the late 80s in the city of New York, they were kind of deciding, do we get rid of this office? What do we do? They evolved this office into the public advocate to be a counterweight to the mayor. And that was in part because they were concerned that if we increase the power or the size of the council, that's going to increase the relative power of the mayor. They were also worried that they were creating this really big administrative state, and there was nobody to hold it accountable. So this position evolved for a very particular purpose there. And I think as we're looking at council expansion for the city of LA, there has also been concern. Are we giving the mayor too much power? Or are we giving the council president too much power? This is an answer for that. And saying we're gonna hold both of them in check by introducing this other third party, this counterweight. If we can go to the next slide. As I've mentioned before, this offers a citywide perspective. And when it comes to complaints, addressing those issues between departments across the city, looking beyond individual council districts, it's important to have that wider perspective. It also gives you a second person to complain to. I don't know about you, you might not like your council member. I like my council member, but I lived for way too many years with Gil Cedillo as my representative. And I would have loved to have had a second person in elected office that I could turn to when it comes to resolving complaints. So that's just something that I think would offer another layer as far as dealing with these issues as far as delivery of services, making sure we understand what's going on with 311 and are really making the most of it. The public advocate is a non-voting member of the council. So they participate in the meetings, they can speak at the meetings, they can introduce and second motions, but they can't vote. They are also an ex officio non-voting member of all of the council committees. They also have the ability to appoint some people. They serve on certain boards. But their power on the council, even though they're not given formal power, I think is a bit liberating because they don't have to respond to a council district, whereas your average council member can be punished. Like, we're not going to put in a stop sign there because you're not playing ball. Like, you can't do that with the public advocate. They don't have those same local responsibilities, and they don't have the ability to trade votes in the same way. The public advocate can also designate two of their deputies to serve in their place on these committees. Even though they might not have a vote, I guarantee you, if you've been watching City Hall, you know there are some rare moments where what they say on the floor, one member speaking up on an item where nobody was going to say anything can uncork a really, really revealing conversation. So it's not this big transformative position. It doesn't answer all of our problems, but I do think it really does introduce a unique voice to the council. The New York City Public Advocate used to have a bit more power. They used to have the ability to cast tie-breaking votes and preside over the council. Historically speaking, mayors in New York City have hated the public advocate because it's somebody that's there to, be in their ear and criticize when they mess up. The New York City Police Department has also not been a big fan of the position because as the biggest department, they get a little bit of attention and they don't like that. So they were stripped of the ability to cast tie-breaking votes or preside over the council about 20 years ago. And the last one I think is a bit more important when it comes to presiding over council meetings, because that wouldn't be a huge transformative change. The council president would still set the agendas and stuff, but we've seen things that happen at this council where comment is abruptly ended. They opt to provide no public comment when there's significant amendments to items that are being made on the floor. We saw that with an ethics commission appointment. We saw that with the redistricting bill that went through last fall. So this is just something that pops up again and again. And I think it would be a really healthy thing for a voice with a perspective of the people to be the person presiding over the council meetings. Even if that's a really small, subtle change, I think that could go a long ways. And I think that might be I got one more slide on this. There's I've gone over all of this, so I don't want to repeat myself and belabor it. I just want to note with the New York City Public Advocate, we've seen some of them, like Letitia James, who went on to go run and become New York City Attorney General, use the office to be a bit more litigious and bringing lawsuits against the Trump administration. We've also seen the current public advocate, Jumaane Williams, during the 2020 uprisings. He was literally on the streets at protests, live streaming and documenting police brutality that was happening at those events. He was having NYPD bikes shoved in his face. He puts out an annual list of the worst landlords in New York City, and one of them actually just got sent to jail. So it is a really unique office. It's not a silver bullet, but I do think it brings a very different voice to the conversation where we just haven't seen any council member speak up in the way on some of these third rail controversial issues that we see the public advocate do in New York City. So I think this is something that would really go a long way for the city of Los Angeles. And I'm just gonna make sure there were no questions in the chat. Cool. If there are any questions on this, happy to answer those at the end. I want to make sure we get this done as close to 7 p.m. as possible. And then we'll hang around and answer any kind of questions on the stuff we've gone over or other matters as well. So if we can go to the next slide, Ross. Really briefly, we've got some City Hall updates. As we mentioned at the very tail end of the last meeting, Councilmember Krikorian was caught using his official office and resources to send out a political email in support of Adrien Nazarian, his former chief of staff. The Ray Chan trial, he was the head of planning and building and safety. He or building and safety. Uh, he was just that got wrapped up, and I would recommend reading the LA Times article that ran this weekend that gives you a really deep overview of the depths of corruption, the number of people involved, the kind of direct and indirect kind of bribery, favor trading that was going on, and the number of people that were not actually prosecuted. The other thing to just note, when it comes to ethics reform, we haven't seen any of it. As I mentioned before, Councilmember Krikorian has not made his appointment to the Ethics Commission. It has been over 250 days that he has failed to follow the charter. And City Council has not changed a single law to address corruption since December 4th of 2019. And we've had 4 council members arrested since then. So we are going to be focusing the next 2.5 months on drawing as much attention to these issues to ensure charter ethics reform makes it to the ballot in November. We went over that in our last meeting. There has been no real progress on that. Council has not touched it. There was an LAist article today that revealed Council President Krikorian is on the fence about it. He supports it, but he also supports waiting to do it. And he gives no commitment on when this thing is actually going to come to the committee for any kind of discussion. That might happen at the end of this month. We don't know, but we will try to keep you in the loop on everything we're doing and need you to help us do to get this on the agenda and on the ballot in November. And I think the next slide is for Jamie.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the update on the Price case. So in early June last year, the district attorney's office announced 10 felony charges against Councilmember Price, and that trial is sort of just starting to get picked up now. But it was 5 counts of grand theft by embezzlement, 3 counts of perjury, and 2 counts of conflict of interest. But perhaps more interestingly, just in very recent reporting, the LA Times suggests that he has been privately served with a probable cause report alleging 21 counts of ethics violations. According to the reporting in the LA Times, the time period that they're looking at goes back further and more expansively than what the DA's office is bringing. And it's interesting to note that this is not something that has been publicly stated by the Ethics Commission. So the fact that this essentially leaked is also of note, because this is not like what we saw with the John Lee case, where they put out a press release after there had been a chance for Mr. Lee and his attorneys to go back and forth. This is something that leaked out, so that's also just something that's very interesting. And I think, as Rob just noted in the chat, there had been many council members who had made comments along the lines when the indictment was announced, like, well, isn't this something for the Ethics Commission? And it is something for the Ethics Commission, but the idea that it is only something for the Ethics Commission is certainly something that I disagree with, because our laws on conflict of interest are very clear. It doesn't matter if you would have been the deciding vote or you would have benefited. Personally, it's the having of the conflict of interest and voting that is the inherent problem, because the way that our laws are structured is they're interested in maintaining people's belief and trust in government. So if you could just go to the next slide. But also very interesting, when a council member has been charged with a felony, under the charter, there is a formal suspension process that can happen, but that process has been stalled. A motion was made in June, shortly after the announcement of the district attorney's charges, and it was heard in committee once in late June and subsequently continued. And there's been lots of chatter as to whether that motion would be brought back to the committee to be heard, but it has not yet. And to me, I essentially consider this council file abandoned. It hasn't been rescheduled. It hasn't been heard by full council. And so it's, I think, at least interesting to me to see how our electeds are willing to deal or not deal with their own. When we saw the Mark Ridley Thomas announcement, that moved to a suspension very, very quickly. But this, no. So just something to ponder and think about as to why that is, and perhaps who's benefiting from the issue not being dealt with and not being discussed and not being in the light. That's fine. Oh, the next Ethics Commission meeting is April 17th. That's the next scheduled one. I believe it's at noon. And some possible things that could be in the next commission meeting. We could see the return of the Moonves and Metrose cases, given that the Ethics Commission rejected them. But I also think that there's a strong possibility that we may see Corey Palka in a future commission meeting. I had several folks reach out to me to say, well, why hasn't the cop who released these sexual assault records been charged? And I said, well, just because we haven't seen it yet doesn't mean that it won't be. Not all cases that are related are necessarily heard at the same time. Folks might have different representation that they're using. They might still be actively negotiating the process, or they might be saying, I'm going to fight this process. So another thing that we might see, although I don't know if it'll be the next one, just given the timing, but we could see the announcement of the probable cause document against Mr. Price. So those are things to look forward to in future meetings, perhaps this meeting, perhaps not. I don't know, because it's confidential. Next one.
And last but not least, I'm just gonna tee things off for Ross, who is gonna be going over the Charter Commission recommendations that the Fair Rep LA Coalition helped come up with. And to just kind of like set the playing field for you, you might be wondering, what is all of this charter stuff that is being juggled in the air right now, and why, and what is gonna go where? I don't really know all the answers to those questions, but to just give you some understanding of what is all up in the air and what is going to the November ballot, we know this much. Independent redistricting for the City Council and LA Unified School District is going to be on the November ballot. There's been a separate conversation about potentially changing the officer discipline system. That might go on the November ballot. Beyond that, we have no clue. The council expansion stuff has not gotten any discussion from this council since November, and it does not appear likely that that is going to be something that they try to push forward. Ethics charter reform is maybe something that is going to be moving forward to the ballot, maybe not. We're going to try to do everything we can to make sure it does. But we also don't know how much of that is going to end up on the ballot. If we just end up with a chunk of what the Ethics Commission recommended, or just a little piece of it, or the whole thing, who knows? All of these conversations about governance reform have illuminated a few things. One, our council members are really bad at reforming themselves. They're also really bad at just doing their homework on these issues, coming prepared, and having intelligible discussions where they are actually hearing from all of the departments they need to. So there's just this realization that they maybe aren't necessarily up to this deep dive, and that we do need to do a deep dive, that when we're thinking about council expansion, maybe we need to think about bigger questions like ranked choice voting and multi-member districts. Maybe we need to be thinking about the entire structure of the city. There's just a lot that is interrelated, and everybody is recognizing that we need to have a deeper, more meaningful conversation about the charter and undertake potentially the first comprehensive charter reforms that we have seen in a quarter century. Last fall, there was a motion introduced to explore this process. And this is something that is entirely tailored to the 2026 ballot. It is not something that is going to be putting together recommendations for this November. It's not clear what their full scope will be, or what the commission is going to look like. There have been some ideas thrown out there, and this is all, frankly, a much more long-winded conversation than we have time for. But the big theme here is this charter commission could do some big things, deliver some meaningful reform, but it needs to have the independence and power to actually get something to the ballot, because as much homework as this commission can do, as much work as it can do, it is still going to have to go through the broken city council we have. And we have seen time and again that when their power is on the line, they really begin to shirk. And I'm gonna, with that, hand it over to Ross. There's a link that he is gonna drop in the chat after he's done, and that will provide you the Google form where you can sign your organization on in support of this letter. And you can you can find a link to the letter itself, which overviews some of the priorities that Ross is going to talk about briefly right now. I'd recommend you read it because this is a lot of information to be getting in just a few minutes, but we are 8, and we'll do our best to wrap this up. Ross.
Okay, well, hello, LA Politicos. Thank you so much for your time. And yes, I promise I'll be brief. So, what are these recommendations? This is all happening in 2026. Why should you care? Well, if I know one thing, it's that in politics, the real game is before the game. For any political issue, the questions that matter most are the ones about the rules before the game starts. Who sets them? What are the rules of play? Who gets to decide them? So, the Fair Rep LA Coalition looks at how we are creating this commission in the first place. We want a majority of commissioners to be selected independently rather than by just elected officials. And there's been so much work done at City Council in just the past year around language justice, around people being able to give public comment remotely as well as in person. We need that here now on vital issues like our city's charter to be able to engage with the commission in the preferred language. That's engaged remotely, guaranteed. That's how we make this a process that's accountable to everyone in LA. We also want to influence the commission's procedures. We want to make sure that when a reform commissioner is communicating with elected officials off the record, we want to know, we want to understand who is influencing them when. And we want to make sure that commissioners can't be taken out by just one elected official. We want to make sure there are rules that say there have to actually be just cause. So they don't have to worry about their position being threatened by just one elected official. And of course, there's the actual outcome that we want this commission to be able to have. We want the commission to be able to put their recommendations directly on the ballot. That will give City Council a good reason to work hand in hand with the commission, knowing that if they don't cooperate on an issue that's really critical to the commission and to the people, the commission can, if necessary, go directly to the ballot and put the question to the people. And of course, we want to make sure that what does go to the ballot has a public electorate that best represents the people, where people will talk through the recommendations and make sure that they are fairly represented. They put them on the November 2026 election ballot, not the spring primary. And if any of those recommendations sound the slightest bit important to you when it comes to potentially rewriting parts of our city charter, we need your help. Please share recommendations, stay informed about how these rules of the game are being made now. And if you're a member of an advocacy organization, please bring our letter to your organization and see if they'd like to sign on. We need your backing now to make sure the commission is set up to be worthy of public trust, and so we can make sure that it makes real reform happen. And I'm just going to drop the link to the sign on and the letter in the chat.
And heads up, if you got our Unregale email last week, you have this link in your inbox. We, now that we know they're probably going to have a government reform committee meeting at the end of the month, it's likely that this is something that we will submit to the committee just before that. So you've got, 3 weeks, maybe more or less, to get your org signed on. This might seem really wonky and weird, and it's not for anything that is going to change this city right now. But there are a lot of really, really big ideas for changing this city that can be accomplished through this charter reform process. And we have really deep systemic problems with the city, and the only way we're going to get out of this is through those bigger picture changes that are going to be discussed in this charter commission. And we all saw what happened with redistricting last time around, where our council members had the ability to just all appoint all 21 members. They could pull them anytime they wanted. They could just completely ignore the commission's recommendations. And that just made everybody lose faith in the process. And that's the last thing we want to see is us setting ourselves up for a repetition of that redistricting process. And this is something that we really gotta do our work on. And with that, we are at the end of our agenda, and this is if you've got to hop off, more than okay. But if you'd like to stick around and ask any questions about anything we went over, anything city hall related, you got some random election you're interested in, we will entertain anything. Um, and Ross, you can go ahead and just turn off the security settings so that people can unmute themselves if they'd like to.
Unmute yourself away.
I find all of your chattiness lovely, Gina. And Jamie,
Thanks, Rob.
anything I want to add before we head off, unless we get any questions?
I just want to thank everybody for coming, and that I don't believe that we can fix the city unless we fix the foundations. Um, you can't build a house without having a solid foundation, and there are cracks in our foundation. There are chunks missing, and we need to, if we want the city to function, there's a lot that we need to repair, a lot of policy that needs to be improved, and a lot that we need to make, a lot of change that we need to make to bring us out of what was done in the 90s and to update it for the world that we currently live in.
Yes.
Yes,
A lot
it's
of
worthy to note the 90s reforms are some of the biggest, most democratic parts of LA that we now all interact with, the neighborhood councils, etc. And this is a big chance to take a big step forward in the right direction at the least.
With that, seeing no questions, thank you all for joining. And we're gonna try to figure out whether we like Tuesdays or Wednesdays, and we might even move to the second week out of the month. But we will keep you posted on what our next meeting date is, as well as everything that's coming through city council. As I mentioned before, it is 2.5 months. That is all the time we got left to make some serious, or put ourselves in the position to make some serious change this year. So please keep yourself engaged and help lean in however you can, because they need to feel a bit of that heat that they had after the Fed tapes if they're going to take this stuff seriously. I think what we've seen so far is they're hoping that things have simmered down and that they can wait this out. And the biggest revelation after the Fed tapes was not that our council members are hopelessly corrupt. I mean, we kind of felt that way before, but like that was very much made clear. The biggest disappointment we've seen since then is that like they're unwilling to do anything about it. They're unwilling to address those foundational issues that Jamie mentioned. And we hindsight is 2020, but we probably should have just said, no, y'all need to just start a commission right now in 2022. We aren't going to go through a 1.5 dilly-dally charade with your government reform committee. And that is those are lessons learned. And all we can do now at this point is make sure we foster some hellish conditions for those in power over the next 2.5 months so they take these issues seriously. And with that, farewell. Thank you all.